when the facts are most obscure, where precedents are lacking, where novelty and confusion pervade everything, the public, in all its unfitness, is compelled to make its most important decisions. The hardest problems are those which institutions cannot handle. They are the public's problems. This is from Walter Lippmann in The Phantom Public, in a book which I take as the equivalent of a prince in the 12th century. I'm not a specialist of any of the topic that you deal with. I'm not president of anything. I was amused to hear about Machiavelli and Alaric and the Pope and many of the other predecessors. I'm going to talk as a sociologist of a strange persuasion, because I am the virtual descendant of Gabriel Tarde. Some of you might know, a great jurist, a great lawyer, and a great sociologist. And since I've just published in English a big book and launched an inquiry, I might interest some of you to participate. This inquiry deals with many topics, but two of them are at the heart of your learned society, namely law and politics. So I'm going to tap on some of the resources of this inquiry, and maybe I will interest some of you to work with us in the future. I wish to clarify three sort of trajectory or concept that your learned society is studying. First, the notion of public, as the quote mentioned. What is the public? The second is law. I mean, how can we understand the strange objectivity and binding power of law? And the third is, of course, politics. What does it mean to talk politically and to act politically? Even though I sometimes qualify as a philosopher, I'm not going to try to define the substance of the essence of these three terms. It would be absurd, impossible, and anyway, you know much more about it than I do. No, what I'm going to do is to try to reconfigure those three terms, public, law, and politics, as a sociologist, albeit of a strange sort. The sociology, and I have to start with this, I'm working with, and that maybe some of you know under the name of Actor Network Theory, or ANT, has the strange sort of standpoint borrowed largely from Gabriel Tarde, because Gabriel Tarde was a jurist, to start with the idea that the word society, or the adjective social, do not define a certain kind of stuff, something which would be different from economical, political, psychological, religious, symbolic, whatever. But that society and social are the result of a combination, an amalgam, if you wish, of all sorts of associations. So for us, in the Tardian definition, sociology is defined as the science of association, not the science of social. It will make no difference in studying if it didn't lead to a very, very important practical difference, is that in this view of sociology, never an appeal to the social or to society does explain anything. It's exactly the opposite. Social and society are what have to be explained. So any sort of, in this paradigm, which is a very small subfield of sociology, not mainstream, of course, you cannot use society or social to study anything, but sociology and social have to be accounted for by type of association, which I'm going to talk about. So if sociology is the science of association, and if what is to be explained is the sort of congregation, accumulation, binding of all these different type of association, the specificity of this association is what we would be interested in. This is, for those of you who don't know this debate at all, it has been played quite explicitly in a famous debate between Gabriel Dard and Emil Durkheim in 1902 that we played several times, and it's on my website as a sort of fiction or reenactment of this great debate. So now the question with this, inside this sort of paradigm or principle of sociology, I don't know what you want to call it, the key question becomes, what kind of association are we going to use to explain the social and to explain this binding, those cables, bonds, ties that we call social, and the accumulation of it makes society. It's clear that calling all of them association is very efficient. It has opened up lots of fields, not necessarily in your domain, but in my original domain, namely science and technology. The fact that we are associated with lots of other stuff, I mean, lots of other element and agency has completely modified the definition of what science and technology and economics are. And yet it's not sufficient. So my recent work is that actor network theory has to be supplemented or expanded or combined by an attention to the types of connectors. And that's where Dard is so useful. They are all associations, and many of those will be studied by you in this week, but the connecting capacity is different. There are modes of extension, or to give them a technical meaning, which I've been working on, their modes of existence differ, and differ radically from one another. It's precisely those differences that the notion of social or society hide. This is why the argument of the sociology of association is so different from the sociology of a social, because a sociology of a social is not able to register the enormous difference there is between the connecting ability or the connective ability of, for instance, law and politics, which are the two topics I'm going to choose tonight because they are in the title today, because they are in the title of your meeting. So my argument will look very esoteric. I'm going to ask you to shift your attention, so to speak, from the domains of law and the domains of politics to the connecting ability of law and politics. And to help you, I think one of a good way to do it is to, I still use the word legal and political for ease of discussion, but let's concentrate on the adverb, legally and politically. Not the domain, but the adverb. And you will see that it makes a difference, quite a lot of difference actually, if we not concentrate our attention to is there a domain of law and a domain of politics and how can we make the connection, but if we deal with completely heterogeneous association and then ask among those many different associations, is there a connecting ties, a sort of hook or link, which we would call adverbially, politically or legally. I hope in this lecture to show that it makes a difference to accept such a shift in attention. First, as I said, the question of the public. Of course, there would be absolutely no chance to detect the connectivity of law or the very peculiar connectivity of politics if we were still imagining that there exists something like a public with a big P, a public sphere, a public interest, something that would be understood as a common interest already there, already assembled, and that would be bigger somehow, more encompassing than, for instance, private interest. Private, not individual interest. I'll come back to this point. So in this lecture, I will start from the well-known pragmatist tenet that the public is a problem, which is, as you know, John Dewey's title, or a phantom, which is the title of a book I just quoted by Walter Lippmann, The Phantom Public, marvelous book, which I published in French. Don't be mistaken to believe that denying the existence of a public with a capital P means that I'm going to speak, or those people are going to speak about individuals' interest. The big mistake and the big difficulty in reading this literature from Tard all the way to pragmatist and actor network theory is precisely that when they deny the existence of a public as a capital P, they do not talk about the individual. And as Dewey especially, but many others, and actor network for many, many, many years now, have shown is that neither the notion of society nor the notion of individual register what the social and the association are made of. It's a very, I say that with sort of despair, I should say, because I've made this argument for about 30 years, and no sociologist whom I know has ever understood the point. But I keep repeating it, and Tard has completely failed because he has been pushed in the position by Durkheim of saying, you do it with individual connection. And Tard said, no, and yet people believe that Tard is a psychologist when he has written about 10 books to say, no, there's no way to do a psychology. But so I make the point without no illusion of being understood, but still I keep doing it, that neither the individual, so I repeat, neither the individual nor the society are the good starting point for any inquiry in the association. And Reassembling the Social is a book entirely on this question. No, the reason why there is no public nor individual is that it's very important, if you accept the argument that there is no public, to understand the connectors that sometimes produce association because of their specificity, bits and pieces of publics, ad hoc publics, in the small p and in the plural, and bits and pieces sometimes of individuals. So this is why it's so important to make the point that you cannot capture those type of connecting activity, of which we call law and society, as long as we don't see that we have to generate locally as many publics as possible. And that it's only at that moment that you begin to see the importance of defining the specificity of law and the specificity of politics. There are, of course, many other connectors. I've myself worked a lot on science and technology, but I have no room for that today. If there is no public sphere, what should we look at? Well, as you all do in this week, I've gone through the list of questions you are going to deal. We deal with issues. So what we are going to study, what we do study, all of us, whatever is our paradigm, is our issues. That is, a set of entanglement, section of a population, bit of cosmos, small bits and pieces of aggregated public values and passion. And as you remember from Dewey, the most famous argument, public is precisely, as I said in the quote before, what is not traceable, what is not formatted, what destroys the connectivity of the previous type of association, which Dewey calls private. So I remind you that private for Dewey, Lippmann, and all this tradition, which was a great American tradition before it was forgotten, private means what in basically not individual, but what you already sort of can survey, trace, format, what is sort of already well ruled. And public comes as a distraction when the facts are most obscure, etc., when the precedents are lacking, when novelty and confusion pervade everything. The public, in all its fitness, is compelled to make its most important decisions. So the word public is associated with uncertain connection. What are the consequences of our action in the whole work of John Dewey? And that's why the public has to be explored. There is nothing which is public by opposition to individual. The public is a mystery. It's a conundrum. It's a controversy, to use a term which we have. There is no across-the-board public interest, and there is no definitive boundary defining what is public, which means that the exploration of the public has to be started for every single new issue, because the issue is precisely what disrupts the rule behavior of the past. This is why society and social can never explain anything, because precisely what happens to a public is what has happened and destroy the sort of well-ordered rule behavior of the past. So basically, social and society explain only what is not important, to make the point a bit too strongly. What is sort of past, what is just N-1 issue coming to the fore, and what has become, to use Dewey admittedly strange term, private. So the second reason why this is quite important is that without an equipment, without specific instrument, including, of course, as you remember from Dewey, social sciences, our own work, our own discipline, but also for media and many other activity, the public is absolutely impossible to emerge and to be maintained in existence. There is nothing final, nothing preordained, let's say, because of course the argument is connected, nothing providential in the notion of a public interest or the general will. And I insist on that, having teaching in Sciences Po, and our friend from Sciences Politiques will understand that nobody has a special unequipped, uninstrumented access to the public good. There is nothing more complicated, more difficult, more inaccessible than the definition of a public good, even for those of us young kids who have studied in Sciences Po, which is not my case, I insist on that. So we don't train people with a direct access, even though some of the French believe that, to the public good. Public is inaccessible. I read again, when the facts are most obscure, when precedents are lacking, when novelty and confusion pervade everything, the public, in all its unfitness, is compelled to make its most important decision. And this amazing sentence, which is a destruction of most of the political theory of a continental version, to use Dewey term, the hardest problems are those which institutions cannot handle. They are the public's problems. So the paradox is the notion of problem, the notion of public is precisely where the things of the public break down. This pragmatist definition of a public as a problem, plus the instrument and equipment, allow precisely the issue to be explored. What are the invisible consequences of the eruption is what we all study, I think, in all of the field that you have assembled for this week. We study their movement. In the word of Nurture Mares, no issue, no public. So it's the dynamic of those issues. The issue has, so to speak, the preliminary, la matière première, the preliminary material on which we all work, and not the spheres of politics and sciences. My own work on scientific controversy and the mapping of scientific controversies are about this question. Okay, so once the myriads of issues and their associated many different contested publics are sort of foregrounded, what we can now concentrate our attention to the two elements which are at the heart of your learned society. The first one is law. The problem with law is that, much like society, you never know when social scientists speak of it, if they consider the domain of law, legal institution, or law as a special connector that contribute to attach issues and their public. And that's a big problem which I've tackled in a long study several years ago on the Conseil d'État. As a domain, law, legal rules, is such complete messed up, an amalgam, it's a mess, as you all know, that there is no way to clarify what it means or what it's made of. Law is not made of law or in law, no more than oil pipeline are made of or in oil. Sometimes something called law is transported, but it's not made in legal connection. When we switch attention from the confusing domain to the highly specific connectors permitted by law, we get a very different picture of the question. As Suzanne Silbey, who is here, give a talk, I think, in Thursday, has shown, the heterogeneity of law and its connection is indefinite. But since I've written an entire book on this from a highly esoteric and extremely boring piece of law, which is administrative French law, in a completely bizarre place called the Conseil d'État, I don't want to bore you with this question, especially because very good lawyers, like Serge Gudvit in Brussels or Kyle McGee in the US, have shown how this shift from law as a domain and law as a connector makes a difference for practitioners. The fact that it makes a difference for practitioners is, for me, a key element in this argument. It's not a sociology of law argument. Does it make a difference for practitioners? The point I need here is simply that law as a connector does something essential to foster or to maintain a public and its issue in existence. Not, and this is maybe something we'll discuss if there is a discussion, or at least we'll discuss it this week, not so much because it provides rules. I think there's a great confusion in using rules in sociology of law. Law is not, I think it's sort of mistake, if I can say that, to think of law as rule-giving activity. It's a rule-connecting activity, which is not the same thing at all. It's a somewhat esoteric point, but any one of you who tries to follow the adverb legally, again, the adverb, not the domain, will sympathize with this point. Contrary to many legal theory, law might have not much to do with binding power of the rules, because rule is a completely multimodal term. I've showed myself that it's largely based on technology and science and so many habits and so many other things, passion, interest, calculation. And so it's not rule that give access to what is the legal binding and connective activity. And as you know, there are as many different definitions of what a rule in law is as there are theorists. But the way rules, whatever their origin, dynamic and substance, are connected, that might allow us to register what I've called in the fabric of law the passage of law. Law is very difficult to pronounce for a Frenchman, so he says law or law or law. You never quite understand. Droit is a much more beautiful word, but we are not allowed to speak French here. So. This is our droit, the power of droit, which is a very fragile power, as Comay has shown and many others, many of their work. But it allows to re-specify what is the power of law if we take it out of the notion of rule and in the way the connections are made, which is what I'm going to try. My argument, which will require much time, but I think I can sum it up, is that law repair the movement of action. Action politique. When we act, we do multiply the frames of reference. We are not the same as before. We have done things which we forget. We have signed things that we have abandoned. There are documents that we have ignored, and so on and so forth. So any action sort of multiply what technically in semiotics we call shifting out, that is, moving into another actant, another time, another space. Well, the very, very flimsy web-like connection of law is precisely to try to keep together what is impossible to keep together. That is, all of this movement through different frames of reference. The canonical example, of course, being the signature, the fact that you sign something, you sort of tie yourself in a sort of way with a frame of reference which we have already quit when we sign because it's someone else, of course, that has done the signature. And yet, somehow, when there is a trial, under the pressure of a trial, there is a connecting activity which can be provided everything else which is not legal is there. So this is why the complete alternance in sociology of law between a complete permeability of law and its objectivity, as you know, It's impossible not to sway from one to the others, because that's exactly the definition of law. It's very strong and very weak and very fragile simultaneously. The reason why I think it's important to specify or re-specify the connecting ability of law in this way is because it allows precisely to simultaneously say law is objective, it has a strong objectivity as strong as that of physics, completely different, of course, but as strong as physics. And yet, every single activity, every single example will show a complete permeability of law to everything else. So simultaneously, you can entertain the two arguments, as many of you have done, in the same way, between what English very nicely say, enforced. When the law is enforced, it means many, many other elements have been pushed together. So the Baroque complication of what holds the law together, which is not law is not held by law, does not mean that without those vincula juris, the public, the issue, will not fall apart. So the reason why I'm re-specifying law not as a domain but as an adverb is precisely to try to solve this conundrum of sociology of law. Every single case shows complete permeability, and yet there is an objectivity of law that every one of you, if you know anything about law, will recognize immediately. One layer, one component of what it is to be associated might be register. This is what is meant, this is what is this is what is sort of missed if we use social to explain law. Sociology of law is not about bringing the social ties to explain for the duration or most of the time the deviation of law. It's just the opposite, as Tardas himself showed. How legal connector, vincula juris, generate, define among the links something which define at the end the social. So it's not completely false to define laws, law as a connector, not law as a domain, as what ties deeds, documents, and agents together. Last point, such a view of sociology, and especially of sociology of law, if you accept it just for the duration of this talk, such a reversion of what is to be explained and what is providing the explanation might seem less bizarre or less esoteric if we compare with another connector, which is exactly at the heart of your learned society as well, which is politics. Again, not politics as a domain, but as, because that would be impossible. It's a completely heterogeneous domain as much as law, and it's hard to make the distinction anyway. No, politics as a connector, as an adverb. What it is to act, to speak, to assemble, to conclude some issue politically, in the same parallel with legally. And you will see it doesn't go the same way as trying to link politics and law as domains. There are no domains. There are only associations, completely heterogeneous. But among those, there are movements which can be defined by their connectivity, by their modes of extension. That's what I'm doing. But strangely, and that I think is very interesting in this meeting, and I think that's one of the interests of your society, is that it's very much more difficult to render precise the connecting of politics than the vinculum juris. As you know, every time you talk to a lawyer or you approach a question of law, you know there is something difficult. There is a technical difficulty. You feel it, something strange, which doesn't transport the usual connection, the usual impression of common sense. Whenever you deal with law, you know there is something, especially administrative law, but even if you don't deal with administrative law, there is something technical, something which sort of interrupts the course of action. But when you deal with politics, we breathe it as something easy. We talk about politics freely. Actually, freedom of speech in politics is a very important element. Yes, I can talk about politics. I have a right to do so. I have even freedom to do so. No difficulty there. It's a cinch. It's a piece of cake. I talk politics. We all talk to politics. Law? No, no, no. Law, you need a technician. Law, you go to someone who does speak this trans speech. I spent 4 years at the Conseil d'État. I've never been able to articulate a sentence in the way they speak at the Conseil d'État. It's very difficult to speak, but politics, everyone can do it. Unfortunately, if you have followed what I said and Lippmann so beautifully described in the pragmatic definition of the public, if we believe to speak easily about politics, this is bad luck, because the public precisely intervene when it's immensely difficult to talk and impossible to act. So the paradox is that we sort of register the difficulty of a connecting activity of law, and we pay almost no attention to the extraordinary smooth movement of political or speech or political action. In other words, the adverb legally signals difficulty, an obstacle, something probably which means going to a profession, but when we deal with politics, we think that we know what it means. And it's exactly where it doesn't work, because the exploration of issues and the emerging public, if you accept the definition of issue and public, is precisely that the exploration of who is concerned and why cannot be registered in the repertory of a past rule. They are useless. It is because this is why it is an issue. This is why, as Lippmann says, it's the public problem. That's Lippmann's most decisive point. It's in that sense that politics is always exceptional. And here the allusion to Machiavelli is well taken. I'm not sure about Alaric, sorry. But Machiavelli, yes. And why it's absolutely opposed, politics has absolutely nothing to do, this is a point which is often made by Law Ortiz, with management, with governance, with gestion, and all these terms, auditing, which are trying to absorb and get rid of politics by another connector, which is my enemy, which I call double click, but I have no time to talk about double click. In that sense, politics is an even more difficult mode of gathering, of extending action, of connecting association than law. And that's the paradox I'd like to underline for your meeting, is how come that we believe that law is technical, requires special attention, and that the adverb politically seems to flow effortlessly into our sort of habit. It has nothing to do, politics yet has nothing to do with agreement, with unanimity. It has to do with producing a will and a group just at the moment when the limits of this group and the nature of this will or agency is ruptured by the eruption of the issue. So you see why the notion of public and issue in pragmatism is so important. Why is pragmatism has disappeared as a political philosophy? That's a very interesting topic in itself. And why is it so foreign to the French and continental tradition? That's another topic. But the problem is here. No appeal to identity, to interest, to value, to standpoint could solve the public's problems. Because it's precisely when the boundary between private in due sense and public are shattered by the issue's eruption that politics as a mode of extension is most necessary. So what I want to attract your attention about is the extraordinary difficulty of the political as an adverb. Not only that, I think it's so important to point out this distinction between the technicality of politics. Not, and this is a mistake often done when people talk about Lippmann, because it will be a sort of delivering the task of doing politics to expert. I mean, the sentence I quoted several times is enough to show you that Lippmann is precisely against any delegation to expert, because that's when precedents are lacking, novelty and confusion are everywhere, that the public, in all its unfitness, has to be brought in. They are the public triumph. No, the technicality has nothing to do with the resort to expert, which is what management and governance ideology is saying, but with the difficulty of actually producing this specific type of connector which is able to hold an issue together and to assemble around it the specific ad hoc public that Lippmann and Dewey are talking about. So the ease of talking about politics, standpoint politics, let's say, maybe, contrasts entirely with the extreme difficulty of talking or acting politically. There's an immense difference, an absolute difference between the ease with which we talk about politics and the way we try or fail to do talking politically. That is, producing the group, which is one of the important, and the will, which is one of the important elements of having an issue. It's perfectly possible. I mean, lots of things, you know that much better than I, but a large part of what has become politics in the United States has become standpoint politics. I express my values, I've finished. These are my values. We had that in France by an importation, actually, of some of the ways of debating in the US during the discussion around the mariage pour tous. I express my values, that's the end of it. Is this talking politically? No, it's talking about politics. It's not the same. It's exactly the opposite. And if everybody speaks about politics, there is no politics anymore. That is, there is no movement of talking politically which could produce precisely around an issue, an ad hoc issue, the associated group with the associated will, just at the time when the definition of what is the will and what is the group is being threatened by the issue. When we know what the group is, when we know what the interest is, when we know what the rule is, here we have to follow Lippmann's and Dewey's great argument, there is no public. This is not in the public interest. The public is when we don't know and we explore the consequence of his action. So I conclude this last part before concluding completely the argument that there is no free political speech, no more than there is a free lunch. It's exactly the same argument. There is no we take politics to be easy. And if you are a sociologist of a social, it flows effortlessly. Social explanation goes out of your computer with no difficulty. I want to make it more difficult to explain what social and make it more difficult to talk about politics. To conclude, and maybe to interest some of you in exploring this question in this framework, very strange framework, I agree, of the sociology of association, not from the sociology of the social, I would summarize the point I try to make. First, this is Marais' argument again, no issue, no public. So I think there's a large confusion in political science between a study of a sphere of action called the political sphere, when in effect, you just have to read the abstract for this conference, we study issues. That is, every time, if it's environment, gender, if it's a question of pollution, if it's a question of legislation, we have actually attached to the issue. So it's actually, if you want, a completely different picture, not about the great question of politics and law, but about many, many different issues, each associated with its little moving public, and which is not registered by any of the notions that are provided to us by the sociology of the social. So the elementary material, so to speak, we are dealing with is not society, law, and politics, but a multitude of issues, each with its own sort of broken rule, destroyed ties, and dissociated values. And yet, as Lippmann says, these are the public's problem. It's not that, that's precisely why the public is there, because the public is exploring with instrument what is the consequence of action, which are not traceable and formatted and visible. So to capture, to close or reopen or navigate those myriads of issues, many connectors are necessary. All of them together capturing or domesticating an issue. It's a bit like, I don't know if the metaphor can go, but when you have, you know, that people are worried about meteorite who could destroy the Earth, and you have to send a rocket. There's a film about that, with little guys trying to take the meteorite and do something there, send a nuclear bomb or something, or a few nuclear bombs or whatever, and trying to dislodge the meteorite from destroying the Earth. Speaking politically is just as difficult. The issue is to tie an issue, to get at an issue, to try to divert it, as many of you who are doing politics in the real, not talking about politics. No, it's almost as difficult. So among those connectors, among those activities which try to domesticate these myriad of issues which are constantly appearing, there are laws and politics. Of course, science and technology, which I've studied most, are crucially important, but laws and politics as connectors, again, not as domain, are what you study. The study of those connectors is a crucial topic for any law and politics field. So I'm just commenting on the title of your symposium, but only when the novelty of the issues are rule-breaking and group-breaking eruption are taken into account. And if you pigeonhole immediately in the traditional definition of what is society, law, politics, and social action, I think it's very difficult to register precisely the surprise of the issue and to be faithful to the title of your symposium, which is Sociologie du droit et action politique. I hope this has clarified some of the issues you have to deal with, and I repeat the sentence to conclude of Lippmann, and I advise you to read this amazing book. The hardest problems are those which institutions cannot handle. They are the public's problem. Thank you very much.